In 05-06, I think we had one of the biggest upsets in the history of Test cricket. A South African side that at that stage was not particularly well rated absolutely and utterly destroyed an England side. The fact that they won 4-1 was pretty big, but also they did this with leg spinners. Lots and lots of leg spinners. Four horsemen of the apocalypse type leg spinners. And like South Africa often do, they were also all-rounders, which meant that their team had an incredible amount of bowlers and a very long batting lineup. It was 1905-06. And in that series, as England often did when they went to South Africa, they had a bit of an undermanned side. They didn't actually think that South Africa warranted a full-strength opposition. And that is because at that point, South Africa had never actually won a test match. And they went from never having won a test match to winning 4-1. The first game they absolutely stole with an incredible last wicket partnership. And even though a lot of us go on about the leg spinners, they really played well all the way through. It wasn't just leg spin that won them the series, and by the end, they were just clearly the better team than England. However, no matter how you look at this, a bit of a weakened English side who weren't taking South Africa that seriously, when it comes down to it, the underdogs won that series for one very peculiar reason. Englishmen had invented a delivery called the Bosie, or that went on to be the Googly, and he taught it to his friend, who went back to West Transvaal and taught all of his friends how to bowl this delivery. And suddenly, all of West Transvaal and then all of South Africa's batters could bowl this delivery that no one else in the world had really mastered at that point. And they had all these guys who could bowl it. And so they beat England on the back of what was largely one delivery, the wrong one. It is even to this day one of the biggest upsets of all time. Not just because South Africa won the series, but because they dominated it. And it's thinking about series like this that has led me to think of what actually is the biggest upset in Test cricket. And so I came up with some sort of brief metrics to work this out. You want to know about the strength of the underdog and also the team that they're playing. So in this case, South Africa were not thought to be particularly talented, although that turned out to be very wrong. And even though it wasn't a full strength England side, everyone still assumed that they would win quite easily. This Test series actually played on matting, which helped the wrist spinners a lot because the ball spins all the time. There is absolutely no doubt that this is one of the greatest upsets in the history of cricket. However, it is not the only one. And I wanted to know if there was a way of ranking the greatest upsets of all time. And that's because I think you could make the argument that perhaps the two greatest upsets in the history of the game have both been by New Zealand. This video is brought to you by our supporters on Patreon. If you want to be part of the community that makes content like this, head over now. So the first thing you're looking for in an upset, of course, is the difference in talent between the two teams. So if you look at this South Africa-England side, they were completely the underdog here and England were the favourites. But with hindsight and now understanding what South Africa was doing, you would have to say that's just because cricket writing wasn't as good as it should have been. There were actually signs there that this South African team was going to be pretty good. The other thing you're looking for is wow. Like when you hear this result, does it actually stop you in your tracks? There is no doubt that if you'd have been a Jack the Lad cricket fan in 1905-06 and you'd heard that South Africa had beaten England 4-1, you would have fallen over. I think impact is a really important one too. Like how long does this kind of last? How long do we talk about it? Does it change things? And when you think about this particular series, it actually leads to something quite remarkable, the formation of the ICC. If South Africa doesn't beat England at that time, there is every chance that the ICC is not formed at that time or in that way. And finally, we have the result. In this particular situation, South Africa beat England 4-1. Like there's tripping over the line and then there's absolute dominance from an underdog. So these are the kind of metrics I looked at when I was trying to put this list together. And it's very subjective, and I'm sure I've missed some really, really interesting series. But I wanted to come up with a group of series that I thought were some of the most surprising that have ever existed in cricket. In 2014, Sri Lanka went to England with a bit of an undermanned side, and no one really expected much. And in the first test, England kind of completely dominated it, and all they needed was one more wicket. And if you go back and look at that last over from Lords, you will see one of the most entertaining moments in the history of Test cricket. But somehow, Sri Lanka managed to stay in and not lose that game, meaning that they went to Headingley with that being the deciding test. Unfortunately, when they were there, they got massively behind in that game. At this point, it was very hard to say that Sri Lanka was anywhere near as good as England as a cricket team. Except something truly remarkable happened. Angelo Matthews and Rangana Harath formed this incredible partnership that completely seemed to break Alistair Cook's brain, and they roared back into the game. But then they still had to bowl England out. And that took an incredibly long time, including on the 5th day when England didn't even have that many wickets in hand. And they took it all the way to the end before Jimmy Anderson was out in the last over. And then he went on Sky and he cried about it. That's how much it meant to Jimmy Anderson. But it meant specifically that Sri Lanka had won that series 1-0. I think when we're looking at the result part of this, we'd have to say that there was a little bit of luck involved. They were massively behind in both of these matches. And if England get one more wicket in that first test, this is a drawn series, which still would have been an upset, by the way. So I put this kind of low down because it's not a series that people remember all that much, but it was truly one of the more remarkable two-test series you will ever see. In 98-99, Zimbabwe was actually a really good cricket team. They had this sort of little engine that could batting lineup that did really well for them. They had a couple of bowlers who could take wickets, and they had played good cricket for a long period of time. But most of their best work was done at home. And when they went to Pakistan, no one was really expecting all that much of them. In the first test at Peshawar, Pakistan actually had a lead halfway through. But in the third innings, they went out to bat and they bowled out for 103, meaning that Zimbabwe only needed 162 to win. Still a potentially tricky chase, but they did it 3 wickets down, which meant for a 3-test series, they were now 1-0 up. Of course, Pakistan were going to come back pretty hard. And in the second test, they were dominating. And then on day 5, when they still had a small chance of forcing a result and winning the game, the entire day was fogged out. Fog stopped play. And I think if you're Pakistan, you're like, fair enough, we've got one more test match, we'll see how we go. The third test match was completely abandoned. I don't even think they released team sheets. And again, fog stopped play. 6 days of fog basically meant that Zimbabwe ended up beating Pakistan 1-0. I think a little bit like the Sri Lanka series, this easily could have gone a different direction. But still, it is one of the greatest results in Zimbabwean cricket history. I have just written New Zealand and India 24-25, 3-0. I covered the entire series, and it's still absolutely shocking to me that this thing happened. I predicted beforehand that India would win 3-0. If you asked me to go back in time and start again, knowing what I know now, I would still go back and predict that India were going to win 3-0. Even allowing for the fact that the batters and the spinners were no longer what they once were, I still cannot believe that New Zealand managed to win 3-0. Maybe, knowing everything I know now, I would go back and do 2-1. So the wow on that is about as high as you can be. Even if you look at the strength factor, right? Not only were New Zealand underdogs, but India were incredible favourites. They had lost one series at home in 20 years. They had lost one series at home in 20 years, and New Zealand hadn't won a test in India since 1988. They're just not really built to go to India and win test matches. And 3-0 is just absolutely remarkable. On top of the fact that India looked like they were in the middle of transitioning into maybe one of the best runs of all time. All they had to do was keep it together for a little bit longer as the older batters and older spinners went out and the new crop came in. And instead, one green top, Ajaz, Patel and Santner did almost all the damage for them on top of all the sweeps and reverse sweeps and everything else. And it was just absolutely shocking. As far as impact goes, we're going to be talking about that test series for a very long time because anyone who was watching test cricket in this era just could not believe it because the wow factor on this one was through the roof. 3 new test teams came in at the end of the 1920s and New Zealand probably weren't ready for test cricket. India wasn't a bad side but maybe didn't quite have the bowling available to them at that time. The West Indies though came in and had some incredible players. And it was a pretty strong England side as well. George Headley averaged 100. Martindale and Considine took 34 wickets at 13 as well. It wasn't as if the entire West Indies team was amazing. They were still carrying a couple of white players who were there because they were white players. But there's no doubt that when they had a good player, they were absolutely incredible. And this was also a situation by this point where England should have known a little bit better how good the West Indies were going to be, and yet they were still shook up. There's no doubt that the West Indies was a massive underdog here. And England was a good side, although they also lost to South Africa around that same period. I think there was a little bit of a wow there, but I think the impact was more important. It probably didn't keep on as long as it could have because World War II comes not long after. But after the break for the war, the West Indies are really seen as the 3rd or 4th strongest team almost straight away. I think this is a really good upset, and if it happened now, we'd all be pretty shocked. But I'm not sure it goes down as one of the biggest ever in cricket. When Australia won the first ever test, it wasn't taken all that seriously in England. Like, there was a bit of surprise, but this was a bit of a made together professional team. They didn't even have stout amateurs to help them, keep down the colonies or anything like that. And it was also a mile away. There were no TV or anything. It was just a couple of newspaper reports, right? And when the Australian team came over, they couldn't actually convince England to put out their best team for what we would now call test matches. There was one particular game where Boyle and Spofforth took 19 wickets, I think, between them and destroyed the MCC. But even with that happening, there weren't a lot of games scheduled. But in 1882, they did schedule one game, and W.G. Grace was going to play in it. So this was a really strong England side. And the reason they put it together was to kind of finish the conversation, to suggest that there was no way that Australia should even be playing England. They just weren't good enough. And Australia were bowled up for 63 in the first innings, which kind of proved the point to everyone that this team just wasn't good enough to compete with England. But when Australia batted in the third innings, a guy called Hugh Massey came out and just basically opened the batting and slogged. It was Victor Trumper well before either were even thought of. And because of that, he meant that England did have to bat again, and they had to chase 85 runs, which even in a very low scoring match was not considered a huge chase. But something very fascinating had happened in that Australian third innings. And it was when Sammy Jones had the ball sort of trickle out on the leg side. He looked at W.G. Grace, he nodded his head, and he left his crease, and W.G. Grace picked the ball up and ran him out. Sammy Jones, a little bit like Johnny Besto, assumed that the nod was enough, but the ball was still live, he was run out. And the Australians were absolutely furious, including Fred Spofforth, a man who in England they had already compared to the devil. And he was absolutely furious. He tore through that England lineup and suddenly made the very comfortable chase look a little bit iffy. Except there was one issue. W.G. Grace had opened the batting and was still not out. The score was 66 and he was on 32 when Boyle dismissed him. And at that point, England pulled off, perhaps still, to this day, one of the greatest chokes of all time. If you think South Africa is choked, you need to go back and just look at how many maidens were bowled. I couldn't count them all out now because there were so many maidens, you would think I was making them up. And England's last 5 batters came out and made 4 runs between them. Australia win the test, and that is where the term Ashes was first ever mentioned. This was a huge upset. No one was expecting that. And in terms of impact, it's one of the highest ever. It was only a one-test series, and it's probably worth saying that the Australian team was a lot stronger than England had actually understood. Although, for the next 10 or 15 years, England did win the vast majority of the series. But being that we're still talking about the Ashes now, one of the major reasons has to be that the impact of this was unlike almost anything else that had happened in sports before that moment. Overthrowing Cricket's Empire is just another cricket history book, but this time written from the other side. Get your copy today. India winning in Australia in 2021 certainly has to be on this list, right? Like, the fact that India had that many injuries, that many things go wrong, the 36 all out and everything else, and yet they managed to sort of break Australia down piece by piece and somehow come away with the win is just truly remarkable. Yes, you have to factor in some of the injuries, but some of the players who did well for India in those games have actually gone on to be really good players as well. So it's not as if they did it with a bunch of players who just all evaporated after that series. They'd also, from a WOW perspective, been really good in Australia very, very close to this tour. So it wasn't as if they were not suited to these conditions because they were already playing quite well there. The result, again, is quite close, right? 2-1 could easily have gone in another direction. So there are plenty of things against this series. It's just that we just lived it, and it did feel like something quite monumental. I think one reason it's still one of the greatest upsets of all time is the strength of the Australian bowling lineup was absolutely surreal. Right? And then on top of that, the chaos of what was going on. They had players at home on paternity leave, maybe their second best seamer had his arm smashed in the first game. Like, all these things just kept happening to them all the way through, and yet in the end, they still managed to win. So it's not the same kind of upset as a lot of these other ones. But still, if you were watching that series, it was almost as remarkable as anything else on this board. Okay, this is obviously about the biggest upsets in Test cricket history. But here's one that probably should have led to a team being a Test nation and didn't. Argentina played the MCC in 1937-38, and they drew that series 1-1. They'd actually had success against the MCC before that. But I went back and had a look at that 37-38 side, and I think it's as strong as some of the teams that were beating New Zealand at that point. I would make a pretty strong argument that around this period, Argentinian cricket was as strong as New Zealand, But if you want my 1930s hot take, I would actually say that Argentina were a better side than New Zealand based on the limited results that we got. Now, it's not a win and it's not a test match. But I think the fact that Argentina in 1937-38 against a lot of incredible English players managed to be 1-1, and it wasn't even a fluke because we'd seen them do something like that before, suggests that this was a really strong side. We haven't ended up with Argentina as a test nation, as after the war, cricket isn't pushed there anymore. So sadly, they don't end up being really strong. But there is no doubt that this is a remarkable achievement that should be talked about a lot more in cricket. India come to England in 1971 and they win 1-0. Now, it's probably not one of the greatest England sides of all time. It was fine, but maybe not quite as strong. And there were a lot of draws early on. It basically comes down to, it's actually quite similar to the Sri Lanka-England 2014 one. The final test ends up being a decider and India get over the line. There was an elephant on the field. There was all sorts of things going on. The captain was asleep. It's a remarkable story and it's worth having a look at. I still think this is a really good upset. One of the reasons I don't think it's right at the top of the list is not long before this, India had also beaten the West Indies. Now, that West Indies side wasn't quite as strong, but they did have recent form in travelling away and doing quite well. So the fact that they've done well in a series just before this, I don't think it lessens it or anything, but it does mean that it is a little bit less surprising, right? Like they were playing pretty good cricket. The West Indies were a decent side. England was a decent side, but India had actually pulled themselves up to roughly that level. It was still a big surprise within England though, because there'd been so much rain, I think everyone had sort of almost turned off from that series. So for India to win it, I think was quite surprising. It's also worth saying that it did have a big impact, right? Like it's probably one of the main catalysts that really starts to change Indian cricket. Do you remember at the top when I said that New Zealand were involved in perhaps two of the biggest upsets of all time? The other one is in 1979-80 when they beat the West Indies 1-0. There's a bunch of reasons why this is remarkable, but I think the most important one is New Zealand beat the West Indies and the next time the West Indies lose it is 1995. So essentially 15 and a bit years later, they dominated cricket over two completely different eras. It was one of the most dominant performances we've ever seen, if not the most. And so then you have New Zealand beating them. But there's a couple of caveats here. This was 1979-80, and in 1978, the West Indies had gone to India and lost the series. So this is kind of at the start of their run, and so you can do that. The other one is that the umpiring in that series is kind of famous for helping New Zealand out a little bit more than it needed to. And on top of that, the West Indian players did lose their cool, and at certain times they gave up because they thought the umpires were against them. So it's very possible, and you can go back and have a look at some of the footage, they weren't always completely trying their best to win this one. But one of the reasons this has to be here is there was no doubt by this point everyone knew how good the West Indies was, even if they didn't know that we're going to go on this incredible 16-year run. But New Zealand had only ever won one test series before this, against Pakistan a decade earlier. This was the second test series that New Zealand ever won, despite the fact that they had come into test cricket 50 years earlier. And then they beat the team that was about to go on the biggest run that cricket has ever seen. They were clearly a massive underdog, and the West Indies were favourites. The wow factor, I think, is more in retrospect than at the time, but certainly it made headlines. I think in terms of New Zealand cricket, it was a huge deal. And if you have a look at New Zealand, they actually go on to be a really good team in the 80s. So I think it did have an impact. It was, though, a 3-test series when they won 1-0 again. And of course, the umpiring plays a small part. But I don't think you can get over the fact that New Zealand had only ever won one series before this, and they decided to win their second one against an incredible West Indies team. Even if it was just at the start of their era, it was a lot of players who that success was built on the back of. The second Sri Lankan series on here is 2018-19 in South Africa, which of course is remembered for Kusal Perera's incredible stealing of a test match. And if that's the only one they won, I'm not sure how high up the list this would actually end up. But when it comes down to it, it wasn't the only test they won. So if you compare this series to 2014, I think there's a lot less sort of luck and randomness to it. They won both the tests. Yes, there was an extraordinary effort to steal one of them, but they won the other one. The other thing that I think is truly remarkable, which is maybe similar to what India did in England in 1971, is they did it with their spinners. In this particular game, it was obviously a bit of a one-off, and the oval, which quite often helps spinners. But maybe there's a bit of an element here of this is the point we realize that South African wickets were changing a little bit. You know, they talk about how they spin more since global warming, and maybe Sri Lanka actually showed us that global warming is hitting cricket. In terms of wow factor, that's pretty high. But if you look at our metrics over here, they were massive underdogs. No Asian team had ever won in South Africa before. The wow impact, it comes in twice because you get the first wow of the incredible last wicket partnership to win the game. And then straight away you get the second one when they win the second test. It's double wow. Impact is where I'm a little bit more confused on this because unfortunately, it doesn't really change anything in Sri Lankan cricket and it's not a series that we talk about all that much. But I do like the result because it was 2-0. And just on South Africa for a moment, it wasn't obviously completely a peak South African side. But I just want to point out that the bowling attack did have Rabada, Stain, Philander and Maharaj in it. Like, this was not a poor South African team. It may not have been one of their best ever. But when looking at the greatest upsets of all time, this one certainly has to be in the conversation. And then I think finally we have England versus Australia in 2005. I feel a bit weird about this because the teams weren't massively mismatched, were they? But in terms of wow, I don't know if you can have a series that captured people's attention more. Now, once Glenn McGrath is not fully fit in that series, there really isn't that much between them in strength at all. And then you have England versus Australia in 2005. I found this on a lot of lists, and I did a lot of thinking about it, and I'm still not 100% sure it deserves to be here. But there is a couple of things that on my metrics specifically, I think certainly needs to be mentioned. For instance, England had not won against Australia in 18 years at that point. And it wasn't that they hadn't just won. They had been absolutely punched around and bullied and destroyed time and time again. Australia just laughed at England. When you look at the strength of the two teams, I still think England was the worst side. However, once McGrath does his ankle, there really probably isn't that much between these two teams, even on paper at that point. In terms of wow, it is one of the biggest wow moments just because that England came from nowhere and won that. Of course, they had been building and everything else, but there were plenty of other times when England had had some good results coming into an Ashes and people thought, oh, something might happen here, and they got punched in the face. So the wow was huge. The impact in England was about as big as any test series we've ever seen. In fact, when we're talking about just pure impact, I think this series and the 2021 Border Gavaskar are two of the biggest. I'd probably put India in England in 71 and also the recent BGT series that we have here for incredible impact as well. They were playing this series in movie theatres because people were desperate to see as much as they could. The 2005 Ashes was like a movie, right? It is almost remembered that way as like some big Hollywood blockbuster, the Independence Day of 2005. The result is 2-1. And of course, a lot of this is clouded by Glenn McGrath and the ankle and everything, and England hanging on for a draw at the end. There was a lot of close games all the way through this. It was a fantastically tense moment. I don't know how I feel about this ultimately being one of the biggest upsets of all time. So here we have them, all these different upsets throughout the history of Test cricket. But one of the questions I really wanted to answer was, did New Zealand have the biggest upset of all time and the second biggest upset of all time? So the only way to do this objectively, and by objectively, I really mean subjectively, but with more of a method, is to go through and actually rank them on all these different things here and to see where they come out. Okay, so obviously this is subjective and nuts and everything else. But I've gone through all the series. Obviously I took Argentina out because it was a draw and it wasn't in Test cricket. But I've tried to come up with a rough idea of, you know, how big the underdog was at any one time, what the strength of the favourite was, the sort of surprise factor, the impact, and what the final result sort of tells us. And I'll be honest, before I came up with these metrics, I kind of thought that the three series that would be number 1, 2, and 3 would be Sri Lanka and South Africa in 2019, New Zealand in India in 24-25, and New Zealand versus West Indies in 79-78. But actually our order is slightly different. I have the biggest upset series of all time as New Zealand in India in 24-25, which I did not see coming. I then have the second biggest upset ever, which is South Africa, England in 1905-06, which is hilarious because I started it with this video and I would never have thought it would have come second. At third, I have India in England in 1971, which is again a little bit higher than I thought that would be. Sri Lanka in South Africa comes in fourth. The first Ashes is fifth. And New Zealand versus the West Indies at 79-80 comes in sixth. Now, is this in any way scientific? Absolutely not. Is there a chance I've forgotten some series? Without question. Have I probably failed to look at some metrics that are very important? Yes, I have. But has New Zealand had the two biggest upsets in the history of Test cricket? No. Have they had the biggest upset in the history of Test cricket? I don't know. Maybe? Are you as chronically online as Moses Enriquez? Then here's another video for you. Or if you also like books and stuff, you can buy my new one on the art of batting. If you loved this video, hit the bell icon to be notified for more.